The fog rolled off the harbor like a thick gray shroud, swallowing the gaslights of the city one by one. For Sarah Thorne, the mist wasn't a romantic mystery. It was a cold, damp weight that seeped through the thin wool of her shawl. She stood outside the towering mahogany doors of Sterling and Sons Emporium, her breath hitching in the frozen air. In her hand, she clutched a slip of paper. It wasn't a letter of recommendation or a holiday bonus. It was a dismissal. The ink was still slightly smeared, as if the man who wrote it couldn't wait for the cruelty to dry before handing it to her. "My hand shouldn't be shaking this way," she whispered to the empty street. But it was. It shook, for the 6-year-old boy waiting in a drafty attic room 3 miles away. It shook for the landlord who collected rent with a heavy cane and a heavier heart. And it shook because of the man she had helped that morning, the man who had cost her everything. Hours earlier, the Emporium had been a hive of velvet and lace. Sarah worked the fine porcelain counter, her back straight, her smile fixed like a porcelain doll's. To the wealthy elite who frequented Sterling's, Sarah was part of the furniture. She was the girl with the nimble fingers who wrapped their crystal and polished their silver. The store manager, a woman named Mrs. Sterling Vane, no relation to the owners, but twice as arrogant, stalked the aisles like a hawk. Her corset was cinched so tight it seemed to squeeze the very mercy out of her lungs. "Efficiency, Sarah," Mrs. Vane had hissed, passing by. "The Sterling name represents excellence. Do not let your gaze wander to the window. The rabble outside are not our concern." But Sarah's gaze did wander. Through the frosted glass she saw him, a man slumped against the iron lamppost. His coat was a patchwork of rags, his boots were split at the seams, and his hair was a wild thicket of gray and soot. He looked like a ghost of the Industrial Revolution, discarded and forgotten. While the other shop girls snickered, and the customers pulled their furs tighter to avoid the stench of the poor, Sarah felt a tug in her chest. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who had forgotten the sound of his own name, because no one had spoken it with kindness in years. When the man finally stumbled inside, seeking refuge from a sudden biting sleet, the store fell silent. "Out!" Mrs. Vane's voice cracked like a whip. "We don't permit vagrants. You'll soil the Persian rugs." The man looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "I only seek a moment's warmth, and perhaps a drop of oil for a lamp. My home is dark and the cold it is very deep. You have no coin. You have no business here," Vane retorted, signaling for the burly doorman. "Wait," Sarah said. The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. She stepped from behind the counter, the silk of her uniform rustling. She reached into the hidden pocket of her underskirt and pulled out 2 copper pennies. It was her lunch money, the price of a small loaf and a bit of cheese. "Here, sir," she said softly, pressing the warm coins into his calloused, trembling palm. "There is a chemist 2 doors down. He sells oil. And please, take my scarf. It isn't much, but the wind is cruel today." The man stared at her. For a moment the grime on his face seemed to vanish, replaced by a look of piercing intensity. "You would give your own wages to a shadow in the street?" "You aren't a shadow," Sarah replied, her voice steady, despite the glare she felt burning into her back. "You are a man, and no one should be invisible on a day this cold." "You're a fool," the man whispered, but his fingers closed tightly around the pennies. "A kind fool, Sarah Thorne." Mrs. Vane's voice was a death knell. "My office, now. The price of a soul." The dismissal was swift. In the 1890s there were no unions for girls like Sarah. There was only the whim of the powerful. "You have compromised the dignity of this establishment," Mrs. Vane said, leaning over her oak desk. "Giving store time and personal charity to a beggar. It is a contagion. If I allow you to stay, every urchin in the city will be at our door expecting handouts." He was shivering, ma'am, Sarah argued, her grit finally showing. "The Sterling family built this empire on serving the city. Is this how they wish to be remembered?" as people who let a man freeze for the sake of a rug. The Sterling family doesn't know you exist, Sarah, and after today, neither do I. Hand over your apron. Sarah walked home through the slush, her boots taking on water. When she reached the tenement, she found her son Ethan, drawing pictures on the frost of the window pane. "Did you bring the peppermint, Mama?" he asked, his eyes bright with the innocent hope that breaks a parent's heart. "You said for my birthday." Sarah knelt and pulled him into a hug, hiding her face in his neck so he wouldn't see the tears. "Not today, my brave soldier. But soon, I promise. We're going to have a grand adventure instead." "What kind of adventure?" "The kind where we learn to be very, very brave," she whispered. That night, as the tallow candle flickered low, Sarah sat by the hearth. The fire was nothing but glowing embers. She looked at the termination letter. In the silence of the slums, the sound of a carriage was rare. Usually, it was the rattle of a dung cart or the heavy wheels of a coal wagon. But this sound was different. It was the rhythmic, sharp trot of high-bred horses, the jingle of silver-plated harness. Sarah went to the window. Below, in the mud-slicked alleyway, sat a black Brumman carriage, its lamps glowing like the eyes of a great beast. A man stepped out. He wore a heavy wool overcoat with a velvet collar and a silk top hat. He looked up at the sagging balcony of her tenement. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The landlord? No, this man was too regal. The police? Had she broken the law by giving away those pennies? A knock came at the door. 3 slow, deliberate strikes. Sarah opened the door, shielding Ethan behind her. The man stood in the hallway, the scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood following him into the cramped, cabbage-scented room. He removed his hat. It was the man from the store, but the grime was gone. His hair was neatly groomed, and his eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, were no longer bloodshot. They were the color of cold steel. "The scarf was quite warm, Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was no longer a raspy croak. It was the deep, resonant baritone of a man used to commanding thousands. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. You were the shadow in the street?" He stepped into the room, glancing at the meager surroundings with a somber expression. "I am Arthur Sterling. My grandfather built that emporium. My father expanded it, and I have spent the last week discovering that my managers have turned it into a cold, heartless machine." Sarah fell into a shallow curtsy, her mind reeling. "Lord Sterling, I didn't know. I only thought." "I know what you thought," Arthur interrupted gently. He walked to the small table and saw the termination letter lying there. He picked it up and with a flick of his wrist, tore it into shreds. "I spent 7 days dressed in rags, visiting every branch of my family's business. I was spit on in the counting houses. I was shoved out of the warehouses. I was mocked in the shipping yards." He turned to her, his face softening. "In 7 days across a city of 1 million souls, only one person looked at me and saw a human being. Only one person was willing to go hungry, so that a stranger could have a moment of warmth." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy parchment, sealed with red wax. "Mrs. Vane has been removed from her position, but I find I have a more pressing vacancy. I am establishing the Sterling Foundation for the Displaced. We need someone who understands that wealth is not measured in gold, but in the dignity we afford one another." Sarah's breath caught. "You're offering me a job?" "I am offering you a directorship," Arthur corrected. "A salary that will ensure this young man never has to draw on a frosted window for entertainment. You will have a home on the square, and the authority to ensure that no one is ever turned away from our doors in the cold again." Ethan stepped out from behind his mother. "Does the new job have peppermints?" Arthur Sterling laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of the room. He reached into his pocket and produced a small silver tin. "It has the finest peppermints in London, young man, and a birthday cake that requires 3 people to carry it." The suspense that had gripped Sarah's soul for years, the constant, gnawing fear of the what if, evaporated in the heat of that moment. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a different kind of emotion now. "There are women with education, women with status." Arthur stepped closer, taking her hand. His touch was no longer the rough, desperate grab of a beggar. It was the steady, respectful press of a partner. "Status is a coat one puts on," he said. "Education is a tool one uses. But grit and mercy, those are forged in the fire. I don't need a socialite, Sarah. I need a woman who knows the value of 2 copper pennies." As they walked down the creaking stairs toward the waiting carriage, the neighbors peered through their doors in awe. Sarah Thorne, the girl from the attic, was stepping into the light. The carriage door opened, and as Sarah settled into the plush leather seats, she looked back at the dark tenement one last time. She realized then that she hadn't lost her job that morning. She had traded a life of servitude for a life of purpose. The horses began to move, their hooves striking the cobblestones like a drumbeat of progress. In the heart of the Gilded Age, where the gap between the silk and the soot seemed impassable, one woman proved that a single act of courage could bridge the divide. Because kindness isn't an antique, it is the only currency that never loses its value. And for Sarah Thorne, the dark night was finally over. The sun was rising on a city that would finally learn her name.
If you enjoy our Western stories, consider subscribing. It really helps us keep creating more for you.